gas prices do not rise only because crude oil moves. For drivers, the pressure can begin in places that are less visible: storage tanks, refinery systems, export flows, and weekly inventory reports most households never read. When gasoline inventories fall, the fuel system has less cushion. That does not guarantee higher prices, but it leaves the market with less room to absorb disruptions. Seasonal demand, export pressure, or crude oil volatility before those pressures reach drivers. As of May 15, 2026, AAA listed the U.S. national average for regular gasoline at $4.528 per gallon. For middle-class households, that is already a budget issue. Each fill-up takes more from monthly income. A commute becomes more expensive before rent, groceries, insurance, or utilities are paid. For small businesses that depend on vehicles, fuel becomes a direct operating cost. That price is not occurring in isolation. The U.S. Energy Information Administration released its weekly petroleum status report on May 13, 2026, covering the week ending May 8. Reuters reported the EIA data the same day. The report showed sharp drawdowns in both crude and gasoline inventories. US crude inventories fell by 4.3 million barrels to 452.9 million barrels. Analysts polled by Reuters had expected a smaller crude draw of 2.1 million barrels. Gasoline inventories fell by 4.1 million barrels to 215.7 million barrels. Analysts had expected a 2.9 million barrel draw. For drivers, the significance is not only that inventories fell. They fell more than expected while gasoline prices were already elevated. When inventories decline, the system has less stored fuel available as a buffer. If the market later faces stronger seasonal demand, refinery disruptions, export demand, or another shock, there is less margin before pressure reaches retail prices. A falling inventory number does not automatically become a higher pump price the next morning. It changes the balance of risk. It means drivers may have less protection from future price pressure. The gasoline market is not only about what is produced today, it is also about what is stored, what is exported, what is refined, and what remains available if conditions tighten. When that cushion gets thinner, the burden can eventually reach the person paying at the pump. The warning signs were visible before the weekly report. On April 30, 2026, AAA reported that the national average gasoline price had risen 27 cents in 1 week. AAA also said the national average was $1.12 higher than at the same time 1 year earlier. 1 week later, on May 7, AAA reported another sharp increase at the pump. The national average had risen 25 cents for the second consecutive week, reaching $4.55 per gallon. AAA also reported that pump prices were $1.40 higher than a year earlier. Before the May 13 inventory report, drivers were already paying more. The inventory draw added another layer to the same pressure. Prices were high, and the underlying supply cushion was shrinking. On May 14, 2026, AAA reported that after 5 straight days of declines earlier that week, the national average was once again rising. AAA also noted that crude oil prices were around the $100 per barrel range. Retail gasoline prices are influenced by more than one force. EIA states that crude oil is the largest factor in U.S. retail gasoline prices, accounting for slightly more than 50% on average over the previous 10 years. EIA also notes that gasoline crack spreads and refinery capacity can influence retail prices. Gasoline inventories are not the whole story, but they are part of the pressure system. The broader crude oil context was already tight. According to EIA's May 2026 short-term energy outlook, Brent crude reached $138 per barrel on April 7, 2026. For the month of April, Brent averaged $117 per barrel. EIA expected Brent prices around $106 per barrel in May and June. EIA also expected global oil inventories to fall by an average of 8.5 million barrels per day in the second quarter of 2026, and by 2.6 million barrels per day for 2026 as a whole. The connection to households is direct. Higher crude prices put pressure on gasoline prices because crude oil is the largest input into the retail price. Falling inventories reduce the cushion. Refinery margins and capacity can add pressure. Exports can move barrels out of the domestic market. By the time the driver sees the price sign, those upstream pressures have already been translated into a retail number. That number affects ordinary life. A worker still has to commute. A parent still has to drive children to school. A contractor still has to move between job sites. A small business still has to deliver. A household still has to buy groceries, pay rent or a mortgage, cover insurance, and keep fuel in the tank. When fuel costs rise, the pressure does not stay at the gas station. It follows people into the rest of the household budget. The EIA report for the week ending May 8 showed a significant detail. Gasoline inventories fell, even though refineries were running harder. Reuters reported that refinery crude runs rose by 370,000 barrels per day. Refinery utilization increased by 1.6 percentage points to 91.7%. Higher refinery activity usually suggests more crude oil is being processed into fuels. In this report, gasoline inventories still fell by 4.1 million barrels. The verified data does not support a simple claim that refineries were idle or failing to produce. For that week, refinery activity increased. The economic translation is more precise. Refineries processed more crude, with utilization rising to 91.7%. The system worked harder to produce fuel. Even with that higher activity, gasoline stocks declined, leaving drivers without a stronger inventory cushion. For households, that is the concern. The market can tighten even when refineries are running at a high rate. More refinery activity does not automatically create immediate relief at the pump if other flows are pulling supply in different directions. Exports were one of those flows in the weekly data. Reuters reported that crude exports rose by 742,000 barrels per day to 5.49 million barrels per day. Gasoline exports rose by 192,000 barrels per day to 1.05 million barrels per day. That does not prove exports alone caused the gasoline draw. It does show that exports were part of the market flow. The United States does not operate as a closed gasoline market. Crude and fuel move through global and regional systems. When exports rise while domestic inventories fall, the fuel market is connected to demand beyond the local gas station. Gasoline exports increased to 1.05 million barrels per day. More gasoline moved out through export channels during the reported week. When inventories are already falling, higher exports can contribute to the perception of a tighter supply cushion for us drivers. Exports are not the only cause. They are one part of the balance that determines how much buffer remains. The weekly demand data adds an important caution. Reuters reported that total product supplied fell by 407,000 barrels per day to 19.89 million barrels per day. Gasoline consumption fell by 59,000 barrels per day to 8.75 million barrels per day. That prevents a false reading of the report. The May 8 inventory draw was not supported by a verified weekly gasoline demand surge. In that week, the demand proxy fell, gasoline consumption fell, total product supplied fell. The verified narrative is that inventories fell even though the weekly demand proxy declined, while refinery activity increased and exports rose. That is a more credible account of the market. It shows pressure coming from several directions at once: high crude prices, falling inventories, export flows, refinery activity, and the approach of the U.S. driving season. For drivers, the result is simpler than the mechanics. The cushion is thinner. Giovanni Stonovo, a UBS analyst, summarized the concern after the EIA report. He said it was another EIA report showing a tightening of the oil market, with total oil inventories falling by nearly 14 million barrels. He also said U.S. gasoline inventories will start from a low level in the upcoming U.S. driving season. That quote identifies the practical warning. It does not say prices are guaranteed to rise. It says gasoline inventories will start from a low level going into the driving season. For a middle-class household, that is the risk. Starting from a lower inventory level leaves less room for error if conditions tighten further. When the market has more stored gasoline, it has more cushion. When stocks fall, that cushion shrinks. The economic consequence is straightforward. An inventory draw leads to a thinner supply cushion. A thinner supply cushion means tighter market conditions. Tighter market conditions can create a greater risk of elevated pump prices for drivers. Reuters also quoted Bob Yoger, director of energy futures at Mizuho. He said, "We did see a large size uptick in domestic production for the first time since the war started, implying we can see producers perhaps starting to take advantage of higher prices and drilling." That points to one possible response in the upstream oil market. Higher prices can encourage producers to increase activity. For drivers, that does not immediately solve the gasoline problem. Crude oil must still move through the system. It must be refined. Gasoline must be distributed. Inventories must be rebuilt. Retail prices must respond through the supply chain. There is a delay between upstream production and what a family pays at the pump. Yager also warned about gasoline price risk. He said, "With the dynamics we are flirting with right now in this market, we could catch the all-time high of $5 a gallon for gasoline again." That is an analyst warning, not a guaranteed outcome. It shows how market professionals were reading the combination of high prices, falling inventories, and tightening conditions. The issue for households is not whether one analyst's warning becomes exact. The issue is that the system showed enough pressure for that warning to be made. The timeline shows how the pressure built. In January 2026, EIA published an outlook saying it expected lower gasoline prices in 2026 and 2027 as crude oil prices fell. That earlier forecast is now mainly useful as context, because the later May 2026 market conditions had changed. By April 7, 2026, Brent crude had reached $138 per barrel. During April 2026, Brent averaged $117 per barrel. On April 30th, AAA reported that the national gasoline average had risen 27 cents in 1 week, and was $1.12 higher than a year earlier. On May 7th, AAA reported another increase of 25 cents for the second consecutive week, bringing the national average to $4.55 per gallon. AAA also reported that pump prices were $1.40 higher than a year earlier. For the week ending May 8th, EIA data showed crude inventories fell by 4.3 million barrels. Gasoline inventories fell by 4.1 million barrels, and Cushing stocks fell by 1.7 million barrels. Refinery utilization rose to 91.7%. Crude exports rose to 5.49 million barrels per day. Gasoline exports rose to 1.05 million barrels per day. On May 13th, EIA released the weekly report. Reuters reported the inventory declines and quoted analysts warning about tight oil and gasoline conditions. Heading into the U.S. driving season, on May 14th, AA said the national average was once again rising after 5 straight days of declines earlier in the week. On May 15th, AAA listed the national average for regular gasoline at $4.52.8 per gallon. The sequence shows that the gasoline inventory draw was not an isolated number in a quiet market. It arrived after weeks of rising pump prices, in a broader environment of elevated crude prices and expected global inventory draws. This is how pressure accumulates. Crude prices rise, pump prices climb. Weekly data shows gasoline stocks falling more than expected. Analysts warn that inventories are starting from a low level before the driving season. Each piece alone is incomplete. Together, they describe a market with less room for relief. Drivers feel that pattern without seeing the data. They feel it when a normal fill-up costs more, when a gas stop becomes a budget decision, and when commuting becomes harder to absorb. They feel it when household costs move together: gas, groceries, rent, utilities, insurance, and debt payments. Gasoline matters because many households cannot easily reduce it quickly. A person may delay a discretionary purchase. A family may cut back on restaurants. Commuting to work, school, medical appointments, and essential errands is harder to avoid. That is why inventory reports matter beyond energy markets. They reveal the condition of the system that sets the price millions of drivers face. The May 8th data also included Cushing, Oklahoma, a major crude oil storage and delivery hub. Cushing crude stocks fell by 1.7 million barrels. Cushing is not visible to drivers at the pump, but storage hubs are part of the infrastructure that supports the oil and fuel system. Falling stocks at a major hub can be another sign that the broader market is tightening. Cushing crude stocks fell. A major storage hub held less crude. Less crude inventory in the system can reinforce market tightness that eventually affects fuel prices and household transportation costs. The report also showed that distillate inventories rose by 200,000 barrels to 102.5 million barrels. That detail matters because not every fuel category moved in the same direction. The pressure in this story is tied specifically to crude and gasoline draws, while distillates increased slightly. The issue is not that every inventory category collapsed. The issue is that gasoline stocks, the fuel most visible to everyday drivers, fell by 4.1 million barrels while retail prices were already high. There is also a difference between wholesale market pressure and retail price experience. A weekly inventory draw does not instantly determine what every gas station charges. Retail gasoline prices vary by region and are influenced by local taxes, distribution, station competition, regional supply, and timing. The verified research does not provide regional price breakdowns, so the national picture is the appropriate focus. AAAS national average was $4.52.8 per gallon on May 15th. It had reached $4.55 on May 7th. It had risen sharply in the prior weeks. EIA and Reuters reported gasoline stocks falling more than expected. That combination supports a serious economic story without exaggeration. The story is not that every driver will pay a specific amount more. The story is that the market buffer has weakened while pump prices are already elevated. That is why drivers may pay more is more accurate than drivers will pay more. In energy markets, certainty is rare. Prices respond to crude, refining, inventories demand, exports, regional supply, global disruption, and expectations. The responsible conclusion is that falling inventories increase the risk of continued price pressure, especially when the market is already tight. That is enough to matter for households. When a gallon of regular gasoline is above $4.50 nationally, even small changes matter. The research does not need a hypothetical family budget example to make the cost real. The national price is already a household fact. A driver who fills up regularly feels the price directly. A small business that uses vehicles feels it through operating costs. A service worker who cannot work remotely feels it through commuting. A family that lives far from work, school, or stores feels it through routine movement. The fuel system turns inventory draws into risk. Risk becomes price pressure. Price pressure becomes household strain. That is why a weekly inventory report becomes a family budget story. The number 215.7 million barrels may sound remote, but it describes the gasoline stockpile behind the retail price system. The number 91.7% refinery utilization may sound technical, but it shows that refineries were running harder while stocks still fell. The number 1.05 million barrels per day of gasoline exports may sound like trade data, but it becomes more relevant when domestic inventories are drawing down. The number for $52.8 per gallon may sound like a national average, but it becomes personal when a driver pays it. The gasoline market works through layers. Crude oil is produced or imported. It is stored, exported, refined, and moved. Refineries turn crude into gasoline and other products. Inventories rise or fall, depending on production, imports, exports, and demand. Retail prices reflect crude costs, refinery margins, distribution, taxes, local conditions, and market expectations. Most households do not need to follow every layer. They experience the result. The latest data shows the system has less cushion than drivers would want at this point in the year. The warning from analysts was tied directly to the data. Stanovo said total oil inventories fell by nearly 14 million barrels, and that U.S. gasoline inventories would start from a low level in the upcoming driving season. Yager said the market dynamics could bring gasoline near the all-time high of $5 a gallon again. These are not official price guarantees. They are market warnings tied to a tightening inventory picture. For the script, they show that professionals were reading the report as a sign of pressure. Drivers do not need every mechanism behind that pressure to understand why relief may be limited. If crude prices remain elevated, inventories are low, exports are strong, and the market is approaching the driving season, the system has fewer easy sources of relief. The current reality, as of May 15, 2026, is clear. The latest available EIA weekly petroleum report covered the week ending May 8 and was released May 13. U.S. gasoline inventories stood at 215.7 million barrels after falling by 4.1 million barrels. Crude inventories stood at 452.9 million barrels after falling by 4.3 million barrels. Refinery utilization was 91.7%. Gasoline exports reached 1.05 million barrels per day. Crude exports reached 5.49 million barrels per day. AAA listed the national average regular gasoline price at $4.52.8 per gallon. Those facts describe a market offering limited comfort to drivers. Refineries were running harder, but gasoline stocks still declined. Gasoline demand did not surge in the weekly data, but inventories still fell. Exports rose. Crude stocks fell. Retail prices remained elevated. The unresolved pressure is the supply cushion. If inventories remain low, the market has less protection from shocks. If crude prices remain elevated, the largest component of gasoline prices remains under pressure. If exports stay strong while stocks are drawing down, domestic supply conditions remain sensitive. If the driving season begins with low gasoline inventories, drivers face a market with less margin for error. The verified research does not support saying that prices will definitely rise. It does support saying that drivers may face more price pressure. A serious economic story does not need to promise a crisis. It only needs to show the mechanism. Falling gasoline inventories mean less stored supply. Less stored supply means a thinner market cushion. A thinner market cushion means price pressure can become harder for drivers to avoid. For middle-class households, the impact is not theoretical. Gasoline is part of the cost of staying employed, staying mobile, caring for family, and participating in everyday life. When the price rises, people do not only pay more for fuel, they lose flexibility elsewhere in the budget. Gasoline inventories are not just a number for traders. They are a measure of how much slack remains in a system that millions of people depend on. Right now, that slack is shrinking.